Okay, so here's my plurilingual journey, and I'll explain why I chose to do it in a video format later on. Okay, so just to start off, I was born in South Korea. I came here when I was an infant, so I was about 4 months old, so I might as well have just been born here. I went to Korean school on Saturdays until grade seven. Besides that, I went to all the schools I went to were within walking distance of me. My parents always tried to retain Korean in me, so teaching me Korean both formally through workbooks and all that kind of stuff, and informally by talking to me in Korean as much as possible. And so that's how I kind of learned to pick up on Korean, to understand it, to write it, and to speak it, even though it's very, very basic. Like it's at the level of like a 5 year old, more or less. And what I do is something called, it's very well known, it's something called Konglish, which is basically English and Korean. And so a lot of first generation Koreans tend to use Konglish a lot. So in the area that I lived in, it was very multicultural. So I never really grew up facing real racial discrimination. In fact, classmates always thought it was really cool that I was Korean. And so I grew up with this sense of pride of me being Korean. Yet, despite this pride of me being Korean, I was never really into Korean pop culture. I loved rock music. I love the Strokes, Coldplay. I picked up on guitar and drums, and as a kid and as a teenager in middle school and high school, we made rock bands and we performed live and all that kind of stuff. And besides being Korean and enjoying Korean food and being proud of being Korean, I otherwise was very westernized in terms of pop culture at the very least. And I also kind of thought Korean pop culture was a bit silly. I thought it was a bit dramatic. I wasn't really into the music at all and stuff like that. Um, and so, you know, sometimes because of the stereotypes of being Asian, or the stereotypes that people hold of certain ethnicities, this enabled me and many others that felt that they were more westernized, more Asians that felt that they were more westernized than their original cultural background, to try to distance themselves from that stereotype as much as possible. And I noticed that a lot of us Asians that don't really connect with that kind of Asian, East Asian culture, pop culture did a lot of that. So we tried really hard to kind of not be part of that, status quo of the stereotypes of being Asian, and that's a concept also known as stereotype threat. In which people are so conscious and so concerned about being put into their racial stereotype that it kind of manifests in a way that they either confirm, or they just kind of self sabotage their own success in a way. And so that's kind of what occurred a little bit during high school, because in grade nine, I went to an art school that was not in my area. And in that area of that art school, it was primarily white, affluent people. And so they weren't really exposed to a lot of multiculturalism. So for them, they saw me as Korean first and then G1. Whereas back in my area, in my schools, I was G1 first and then I was Korean. Okay. And even when I was Korean, it was a sense of pride, and they were very enthusiastic about it. Over in Kothra, which it was in the more affluent white neighborhoods, they wouldn't even know that I'm Korean. They would just think I'd be some Asian kid. Okay, and me having social anxiety, it didn't really help break that male Asian stereotype as shy and unconfident. So for quite some time, being Asian became a source of embarrassment, or became um, a sense, a negative thing for me for a little while, and I didn't like that because I knew deep down inside, um, I always fought hard to be proud of being Korean. So I was still very proud and very happy that I knew at least how to speak and write in Korean, even though my knowledge of Korean is very, very basic and very rudimentary. Because I would meet other family friends, my parents friends would come to me and say hi, and they'd be really impressed. Even though my Korean was really bad, they'd be really impressed that I could at least hold some sort of decent conversation and that I didn't have a thick English accent when I spoke in Korean. And that felt good to me because that felt like, for me, it meant that most Korean kids that are born here, they lose the ability to understand or speak Korean entirely. And so I was very proud of myself that I was able to still speak Korean. So being bilingual was a sense of pride, and it always has been. And so being bilingual, it also really opened my eyes to how different people can perceive the world around them and each other, and how much linguistics and language can shape how people perceive the world. And so it reminds me of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I don't know if you've heard of it before. I'm sure you have. But some words in Korean, I noticed I couldn't accurately capture it and translate it into English. And I even noticed, just in the way people spoke, the tone and cadence and rhythm of Korean, it illuminated a different kind of personal communicative experience that could, literally never be experienced when speaking English. And so that extra added perspective was a really interesting thing for me growing up, to notice how different people see the world and each other through language. And that's kind of what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was all about, is that the language kind of shapes how you perceive the world and how you understand the world. But being more fluent in English, I could also see how different people treated me than other Koreans that didn't speak English fluently, or at the very least had a very noticeable accent. And so it's like my fluency in English immediately changed people's perspective of me. Now it's different because I have all these tattoos that are in English, but before that, it's almost like I used my English fluency as a way to tell people, hey, I'm not what you think I'm not what you would call a fob, which is fresh off the boat, and the stereotypes that are connected to people that are new immigrants to this area. I'm one of you guys, kind of thing. And so in a sense, it was a bit of that stereotype threat where it's like, hey, I don't want you to see me as this stereotypical Asian because, hey, look, I can speak English quite fluently. That shows you that, I was raised here. I understand Western culture, and I just look Asian, and that's about it. Um, but yeah, yes, I understood Korean to an extent, and my vocabulary suffers a bit, and it's hard for me to kind of structure sentences. And so, yes, I use a bit of Konglish, but I still know how to write, I still know how to read, I still know how to carry a basic conversation in Korean. But English, that was my domain, and it showed. I was always a very creative type, very expressive, and I used words a lot, and as a way for me to articulate and express my thoughts, my feelings, my ideas, and my imagination. When I was a kid, I would write stories and screenplays and write extensively in journals. I did really well in English classes and did quite well whenever it came to essays. I wasn't the best of the best, but I was pretty good. And so, what also started happening in the last few years was this huge boom in K-pop, which is a genre of music characterized, well, by Korean music. and it exploded here in North America, and with a huge fan base. And then I started noticing, in the film industry, there's been a growing um, a growing number of films where Asian people were more than just the token Asian stereotype in these films, especially with Parasite, a Korean film winning several Academy Awards. I think last year or 2 years ago. Things were changing. The perspective of Asians were changing, and so um, even though I still didn't really particularly like K-pop, I've noticed that it's almost like more people were viewing me as, yes, I'm Asian, but now it's different. Now it's not so much as a deficit or so much as a negative stereotype, but it's like, oh, you're Korean. That's awesome. And so it kind of reminded me of back when I was in middle school and people were really interested in me being Korean. And so I'm all for it. I'm all great for it. And I think me being able to speak Korean too is like an added level of just, people's minds are blown and things like that. So you can see that kind of cycle of how Asians and Koreans were perceived, how it kind of went from one side to the other and back around, and that kind of circular um, experience for me as a bilingual, and as somebody that speaks Korean. But being bilingual, I was able to empathize with those whom English was not their native language. So I can only imagine how difficult it must be for them to come to a new country, to learn an entirely new language, and to still be faced with a lot of ridicule, discrimination, and stereotyping. And the video that we saw in one of our first classes, it really resonated with me, as I never really understood how people could think that way. Like if you went to their country and didn't know any of their language and just started fresh, you'd probably be having a worse time than this person is right now. So I don't understand how people could equate, English language competence with intelligence. I can see how some people might make that connection, what vocabulary they're using, what's their tone and cadence when speaking. Is it very colloquial? Is it very professional? That kind of stuff. But when you know that English isn't their native tongue, and you know that they're fluent in another language, I just don't get how people still judge these people based on their English language competency. And so I spoke about a time where I had a coworker. I was working at Booster Juice. I had a coworker. He was from Gujarati, which is a place in India, and he had a very thick accent. And he just came here a couple years prior, and a disgruntled customer came over and was arguing with my coworker, and he was simply telling the customer what the rules were, and that he couldn't change it, he couldn't give him a refund. And this customer's getting so upset and so mad, and so I come in and I say literally the same thing. I tell him exactly what the rules are, what the regulations are, and that we can't give him a refund. And I'm quite confident that because my English was much more fluent, he was immediately just understanding and left. And so, that was really baffling for me to see. And also just, seeing how my parents speak to other people in English, and how kind of the difficulties that they have expressing how they feel and things like that, knowing how fluent they are in Korean, how much more articulate they are in Korean. And I would hate for people to judge my parents' intellect based on their English knowledge, even though they're incredibly intelligent and can communicate their intelligence in a way, just in one language though, just in Korean. You know what I mean? So, okay, here's what I want to get to. Why did I choose to submit this as a video format? And I apologize, it's 14 minutes long, but this always happens. I hope you won't dock points for that. Well, what we learned in our classes and through the reading we did from Solano Flores It's one thing to write and another thing to speak the language in real life. Yes, I agree that far more articulate, that, I agree that it sounds far more, that I sound far more articulate and well spoken in a text format. And this is because I get time to think, I get time to evaluate, examine, I can carefully curate the words to really most accurately describe things. But in person, you don't really do that, right? But one thing about in-person communication is that the language is so much more than just the words coming out of your mouth. It's how you say it. It's how you emphasize some phonemes over others. It's how your face contorts. It's your hand gestures. It's your body language. It's your eye contact. That's all communication. And so people are inherently sociable. No matter how much we hear people say that they hate people or that they're really introverted, we crave human connection and communication. Even now, I can tell that most people would rather see me talk in a video format rather than have me just have them read a long essay on my plurilingual journey. Besides the passivity of watching rather than reading, who I am is not just the words I choose, but how do I say those words? What does my face look like when I'm saying those words? And what are my hands? What's my body doing when I speak? And this is culturally dependent too. So when I speak in Korean, my hand gestures and body language changes. It's different in a way that I can't describe in English, but it's different. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I want to say, hi, I just want to know, where did you get those shoes? So in English, it sounds like that, but then it looks like that when I speak it. In Korean, it's like, 안녕하세요. 그냥 혹시 알고 싶은데 그 신발 어디서 가져왔어요? Right? And so you can tell that it's different. In Korean, in English, it's almost like I'm very abrasive. Hey, I just want to know, where'd you get those shoes? In Korean, it's much more somber. It's much more like, 안녕하세요. 그냥 알고 싶은데요. 그 신발 어디서 가져왔어요? That you can already tell that I'm saying something different. Maybe even if you muted the sound, you can kind of tell that something differently is being spoken about, even though the content's the same. So I'm sure that anyone that grew up in a multicultural area or city can agree that you can tell people that aren't speaking English. You can tell people aren't speaking English without even having to hear what they're saying. It's how they move their body. It's their hand gestures. It's the way their lips move. And I think that's really fascinating to me. And so I don't want to keep it for long. I know it's supposed to be only about 7 minutes and it's close to 20 minutes now, but that's kind of my journey, and that's my relationship with my bilingualism and my relationship with my Korean ethnicity and my background and the Korean language itself. When thinking of myself as a teacher, I look back on what Solano Flores wrote about how teachers can incorrectly judge one's written English with their communicative, in-person, and social English. Whether they over or underestimate, they'll base their judgment on one's written English aptitude. But of course, those aren't the same thing, and this kind of judgment can even be held towards native English speakers. I know plenty of people that are way more articulate over text than in person, and vice versa. It's almost a stark, surprising difference at times. And so we have to be mindful of how language works differently in various formats and understand that, one doesn't always equal the other. And as Flores pointed out, language differs depending on the dialect, the register, even code switching. It just points out to how complicated language is, and that regardless of one's language skills, we need to view all students with open ears and eyes, especially when it comes to those of which English is not their native tongue. And that we scaffold their learning and support them in equitable, not equal ways to help them reach not only their goals in language learning, but academically and socially as well. And so now that's the end of my journey. So thanks for listening.